Hey everybody, and welcome back to the second video in the series of things that you can do. We're going to do projects in this video. Projects are a system that doesn't exist in the RPI engine or similar MUDs. They're something that's unique to FutureMUD, and they solve a slightly different problem. When you think about the four pillars of what people are doing, you've got foraging, butchering, crafting, and projects. They're the sort of four main economic activities that people are doing. We covered foraging in the last video. That's sort of finding small stuff. Usually most RPI MUDs have the ability to forage for really minor stuff like food or some small items that you could sell, or firewood or something not terribly consequential, not terribly high skill. Butchering is how you do skinning and making economic use of corpses, so for hunters and all that sort of stuff. That'll be covered in a separate video. And crafting is how you sort of actively do something. You start building a sword, or crafting a bed, or something along those lines. The crafting systems vary from incredibly simple, like Armageddon, where it's pretty much a recipe list, through to the RPI engine, where it had multiple phases and some complex interactions. FutureMUD can do crafts in either of those ways. But one of the things that both of those share in common is that it's something you're sitting there and doing at the time what you're logged in. So if you wanted to be a craftsperson and you were working on your crafting things, you're probably going to be locked away from everybody else, role-playing in your private backroom or something like that. Or rather than have something realistically take a long time, like, say you're crafting a plate mail bit of armor, you don't want the craft to run for 4 in-game hours, so they have to sit there logged in just banging on the thing. But logically, some of these things do take some time. Projects is one of the ways in which that problem is solved. So a project is something that runs regardless of whether players are logged in. So each player has one slot for working on a project at a time. They can work on as many projects as they want over time, but at any given time, they're only working on one project. But they are working on that project when they're not logged in. So you can have some very long-term stuff where they're working on the project. Like, for example, you might have that aforementioned plate mail. Maybe there are some craft steps along the way, but the final step of assembling that into an actual, plate mail vest or something like that, maybe that's a bad example, but some complex step that would logically take days and days of effort, that could be a project, and that could progress whether they are online or not. It's sort of assumed that it's what they're working on when they're not online. It's a background activity. Now, at the same time, there's also the ability to set up personal projects, and what I use these for is to give an interesting choice to people whether they are crafting or doing something else. So the personal projects are just another thing that you can work on, but they do something different other than creating an item at the end of it. The best place to go to look for these is some examples in LabMUD, so I'm going to go there. So I don't have a huge number of projects in LabMUD, but I did have a few. And one of the classic ones, to give an example of this personal project, is the personal improvement project in LabMUD. So this particular project, called Personal Improvement, it's always available to people. Talks about working on some aspect of improving yourself. And basically, it's what's called an infinite project. The phase has an endless thing you work on. So in a projects are set up into phases. You always have at least one phase, and inside those phases there are a bunch of labor requirements. I probably should have jumped to an easier example before jumping into that one. Let's actually go and look quickly at project 2. So this is probably an easier example. This is something where you're working on creating a new room. In this case, you're digging out an underground base. So in the first phase, you need 2,880 man hours of labor, and there's a multiplier thing called supervisory labor, which makes it go faster. So and another important thing about projects is that more than one people, well, you can set up how many people can work on each of these. So for this creating a new room project, 2880 man hours could be that many hours of a single person working on it, or it could be half of that of two people working on it, or a third of it of three people working on it, etc. So when you join a project, you join a particular labor. So this digging one probably has a either no skill requirement or a very easy skill, and the foreman probably has some other type of skill. So you could set up so that there's an engineer or a lawyer or an architect or something like that is needed for some aspect of this. You can also have material requirements. Unlike crafts, there's no concept of having to have a tool in your hand. Like when you're crafting, you can say you've got a hammer in your hand, but it doesn't consume the hammer. When you talk about material projects for material requirements for projects, it's always consumed. So the assumption here is that you use up 2 shovels. Somebody's got to supply the shovels to the project. Similarly, in this second phase, you can see there's a whole bunch of other ones. 200 nails, screws, and rivets, 30 pieces of shoring timber, and 2 roof beams. So for those of you who haven't played FutureMUD, when people actually join a project, they can start one, they can join a project that's already there, and they join a particular labor. They can supply material to a particular material requirement, etc. And then when the project is finished, or when a phase is finished, it executes a prog in this particular case. But it could do something like loading an item as well. So jumping back to our first example, because I wanted to talk about that, you can have impacts on people for working on a project. So in this particular case, I'm doing a positive impact. So if they join this personal improvement project, which is a personal project, not a local project, so it doesn't appear somewhere in the world, it appears just for them. They could join, pumping iron, they could join cardio, they could join yoga, they could just join studying, they could join self-affirmation, they could join mindfulness, and depending on which one they chose, it gave them a buff to a stat. And in this particular case as well, these buffs didn't kick in immediately. They had to be working on it for a number of hours. So the idea was that the fighters and the non-project people would still have something to do with this project slot. If they wanted to jump over and do some work on a different project, they would have to do it, but they couldn't just say, all right, I'm going to stop working on this project. I want to go spar, so I'm going to switch back to this, because it would have a lag for it to kick in. I'll show you how to set all this sort of stuff up a little bit later in the video. Similarly, I had a couple of other personal projects that were interesting. Rest and recuperation. Even if you don't do the other one, I am in 2 minds about the stat boosts one. I thought that was an interesting choice, and I think a lot of the players did as well, but it kind of becomes a little bit mandatory. There's probably some other things you can do. But this one allows you to use your slot to make your healing rate faster. So actually it makes you heal 200% faster and gives you a small bonus to the checks as well. These can be negative as well, so you could have, working a sanitation job that makes you heal slower or something like that. But healing faster is something people always like to do, especially in an engine that has things like bone breaks, because that applies to bone break heal speed as well. Again, there's a delay before those things become effective. I think it's 3 hours for rest and recuperation. So it's really useful for those longer term type things. But it also does apply while they're offline. So it applies to offline healing as well. And then I had a final example in FutureMUD. Actually, no, I have 2 more examples. So Study Spark was an interesting one. I had a little mini game where if you played a thing called the Dread Zone and you got a certain item that was rare to drop from the Dread Zone and you ate the item, it was a pulsing energy crystal, but if for whatever reason you decided to eat it, it would set a flag on your character, can study spark to true, and then this project would appear in your list, and you would have to study the spark, and as you studied the different phases, you would get some negative impacts to your stats while to represent the toil that it was taking on you, and then at the end of it you would get a thing called finish study spark. You would get a flag on you that said you had studied the spark, and that would actually give you the ability to cast some magic, some technomancy magic. So there was a little interesting game there, but this was just another way to use the system to do that kind of stuff. And then jobs are probably the final one that I've set up in FutureMUD. So I think I touched on this in the economics video, but when you have a job that people have, you can say that there's a project associated with it, and the effort that they put into the project determines extra pay. So you can have, if they don't do the project, they're just turning up to work, they're just doing the minimum possible, they get a certain amount of pay. But if they put in the extra effort, they're putting in extra hours, they're racking up sales or commissions or whatever, they can get some extra money per pay period. And this type of project is how that was done. So job effort being the impact from a labor, which was an endless one. So in this particular one as well, we had the ability for them to work diligently, or we had the ability for them to work overtime. So working diligently, the cost of that is that they're taking up their project slot to work on this, so they're not doing something like healing faster or getting stat boosts or whatever, but it gives them a certain amount of, I think it's 1/10 of their chemistry skill in job impact. Or they could, if they really want more impact, they can work overtime, which gives them double the impact, but they're a little bit overworked, so they get -1 to their con. So yeah, that's projects. The things that I got to say, they're optional. I don't think all of you will use them, but they do have their place. So the personal projects, we've kind of covered some ideas. I'm always really keen to hear additional ideas about personal project types other than the ones I've created. Some other ideas I have but haven't yet implemented are things like learning languages. So instead of having languages automatically branch, or even any skill, incidentally, not just languages, as an optional thing, instead of having branched stuff just automatically get added, perhaps have branched stuff give you an opportunity to learn it, and then you have to take a project to actually convert that opportunity into a skill opening or something like that. But similarly, you could use projects for big multi-person tasks that happen in your world. So something like repairing the city gate. You might have something where the city gate gets damaged in an event, and people have to join a big project. It would be a non-personal project. It would be what's called a local project, and they have to repair it. So how do we set these up? Let's set some up on the demo mode. So we're going to edit a new local project. All right. So what do we do now? Let's have a really trivial project just to show what we need to do. Let's pick a skill. let's say we're going to do, let's make it a non-crafting skill. Let's go administration. All right, so project set. Here are all the things we can do with projects. We're going to call this project shuffle paper. This is a paper shuffling project for bureaucrats. And we're going to say in the phase 1, we're going to add a labor type. This should tell us the, oops, I did not want to do that. Get rid of name. So we've got 3, simple, endless, and supervision. Simple means that there's a certain number of hours people need to do, and when they finish those hours, the project can move on to the next phase. The project needs to complete all simple things added to it before it can move on. Endless is mostly used in personal projects to make something just never finish. And supervision makes other stuff go faster. So you can have a supervision modifier that's optional. Supervision labor is always optional, but it makes people's effort on the simple do better. So in this case, we're just going to add a simple labor type. All right, so it's called work. So we've got labor. We're going to call the name of this one, what's the first thing you do when you, I don't know, open paper blocks? No. All right, work is what it was called. Maybe it has to be one word. Shouldn't have to be. I'll fix that later. Let's just call it work again. Oh, we renamed it to open, didn't we? All right. So let's say trait, and we're going to say that it requires administration. So in order to work on this, you need to have the administration skill, and that's also what it uses to determine how fast it goes. And we're going to say that the difficulty is actually very hard. We can toggle whether it is mandatory or not. So we can say it's optional or it's mandatory. We're going to say we're going to keep it being mandatory. And we are going to say that we need to have a minimum skill of 50, which would appear as specialist to be a paper pusher. And we need, I don't know, 50 man hours of this labor. All right, so there's one of the labors on it, and then we could say project set phase 1. We could have a material requirement. So we'll add a material requirement. I've only got one type at the moment, which is simple, but I might expand that in the future. We will say that it needs to be an item with a particular tag. I didn't set up any items with tags. Should have thought about that. Okay, banana. Food. All right, so it now requires us to give we'll give more than one. Say you need 5 bananas amount. description. Hungry administrators require bananas to function. All right, and then we will do where are the actions? Oh, it actually doesn't mention the actions in that other help file, but there it is. Phase 1, action add. So we can have a skill use or a prog. So it can either execute a prog or it can use a skill. So the skill use, we'll add a skill use one anyway. So we'll add a skill use. Actually, skill use is mostly useful for personal projects because there's no actual, we don't necessarily want the person who initiates this project, which is a local project. You know what, let's give it to him anyway. Set phase 1 action, call it name, skill up, trait, they can get it in administration, and they can get the difficulty being extremely hard. Then we need to fire up a quick little prog to do something. Prog edit new, we'll call it finish paper shuffle. Worthy. This is the one I wanted. What are the parameters? Project. Add project prog text, and what we will do is copy prog 327 raw. That's a little trick you can do to get rid of those line breaks if you need to. And then we will load item 13 and we'll put item in the cell and we'll send block project completed. project set action phase 1 action name, we'll call it do prog what was that prog called? 1343 up here 1 and 1 y. Let's see if we can do that. Thought so. I really should have made in FutureMUD. I have. That's right. All right. Prog edit new universal text prog set any parameters return text set text return error message. Project set y 1344. All right, we have our first project. We got there in the end. What do we do with it now? Well, 4 players, they can type projects. In this particular case, you'll see I don't have any personal projects. There's no local projects in the room that I'm in, and I'm not currently working on anything. If I was a player, I would type catalog to see what types of projects I could start, and then I would start shuffle paper. All right. So what's happened there? Not sure why it's created twice or why no, it actually hasn't created twice. It's just appearing in the list. But we haven't joined it. So project join shuffle paper. Got to do the ID, which is 1. Okay, so it's telling us we're not qualified. And remember why we're not qualified. We are not qualified because we need to have administration, and we don't, as you'll see. So let's add it, and we needed to have it at 50. So let's add skill level me administration 30. So we have administration now, but we don't have a high enough level. Let's see if we can join. Still not qualified. Change it to 60, so we should be qualified. There we go. So we're now working on this project. As it says there, we're working on it. We can only be working on one project at a time. We will be working on it whether we're logged in or whether we're not logged in. It checks every 15 minutes and adds progress based on people's skills, etc. None of the materials have been supplied, so project supply 1. What was the material? Hang on. was shuffle paper. I'll just call it material. Okay, so we're supposed to be providing some bananas, so let's load some bananas. Oh, that's not a banana, that's an apple. I'll junk the one that I have in my hand. Actually, you know what? I'm going to purge it and junk everything I have in my hand because the tag was something I added afterwards. Let's load those bananas again. That's odd. I should. Oh well, that's not working for some reason. I'll look into that later, but that's one of the things that the players do. Let's see if there's been a project tick yet. I wonder if I have. Alright, I don't have a way to make that go faster. And it won't echo there because it's not on debug anyway. But believe me when I tell you, after 15 minutes I will have worked some amount of work on that shuffle paper phase. On FutureMUD you can see some other examples. So at the moment my character is currently working on the rest and recuperation. If you've got impacts, it shows them here. You can give them a name. Yeah, so projects, that probably seemed like quite a lot of effort to set these things up, and they're not for everything. You wouldn't replace, it's not a choice between, say, crafts and projects as a system. Projects are not meant to do everything crafts can do. They're for very specific scenarios. I encourage you to come up with some personal projects, and again, you might think of some interesting options that I haven't. You could give impacts to stats, you can give bonuses to skills or penalties, healing rates. I'm happy to add anything additional if you think of something cool. But there's also the ability to do big scale stuff that lasts over multiple days or has multiple people. You can tie it in with jobs as well. In the future, I intend to put a way to have these local projects pay people. So if you start one of these projects and it says you got to supply five food, or you've got to work on this, set it up so that there's like hourly pay for working on it, or there's a bounty for putting the stuff on. So basically you could have like big projects that are public infrastructure stuff that people could just join and choose to use their time and get paid for. And you could even tie it into, events and systems and stuff like that. Like, maybe people have to repair the gate after, an attack from the enemy. They have to build siege equipment. They might be doing stuff like what I did in FutureMUD with the building rooms. That is something you can do. So I have some code there. You might want to screen capture it if you're interested. But basically, when this finishes, it grabs a build direction, it creates a new room completely in the prog, and puts it into play. So in this particular case, the idea was to allow players to actually dig out an underground base. You could use this for like digging out a mine or something like that, and you could have it, they start digging and they choose a direction, and then they dig to the north, and then when they finish the project, load up the room, and you could load up some random like mineral veins or something like that they can then use their crafts on to mine. So yeah, I'm happy to spitball people ideas. I'm happy to add new stuff. I didn't get to do much with projects in LabMud because it came so late in the piece. We really didn't have much of a game left by the time I'd finished working on this system, but it is a piece of the puzzle, and thank you very much for listening.